Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the first Citizens Climate Lobby call of 2021. If you're new to the call, my name is Mark Reynolds, and I'm the Executive Director for Citizens Climate Lobby. We are a science-based, evidence-based organization. We do what we do because the best scientists in the world, the IPC scientists, tell us we must. We work on the solution we work on because the overwhelming consensus of economists that the most efficient way to deal with the problem is a steadily rising fee on carbon with the money rebated to households. In fact, when I was in former Secretary of State George Shultz's office, who many people know he was the Secretary of State, he was also the Secretary of Treasury, but he was also the head of the economics department at the University of Chicago. He said when a problem is this big, you do the most transparent, hardest to rig solution. So we argue for that solution. And we lead with solutions because the social scientists tell us that if you actually want people to act, if you want to bring people along, you lead with solutions. I don't think it's unusual to be science or evidence-based. I think most organizations are that way. But we also ask ourselves to work in what we're for rather than what we're against. And we start with what we have in common with other people. Now, that may be a little bit more difficult than usual right now. In 2009, I created CCL's one and only one rule, which is anytime you met with an elected official, the basis of that meeting would be admiration, respect, and gratitude for their public service. Some of you can't get there right now, and that's fine. There are plenty of other ways that you can work on political will. But just one example for me, I was talking to Barry Goldwater, former senator from Arizona and presidential candidate's son 5 years ago. I'm a liberal from Utah. He's a conservative from Arizona. And he said his father used to take him on hikes all the time. And he'd walk him up to trees and he'd say, son, that tree has more character than most of the people you're going to meet in your life. Now, I can start at that point with somebody. That's a starting point that I can build a relationship from. And so we start with what we have in common with people. I also want to point out that while we're obviously very excited about working with the new administration, we have a Congress with very small majorities for the Democrats, and we're going to need votes from both sides of the aisle. So what we've been working towards, which is a bipartisan solution, we still will need people from both sides of the aisle, and I think that that is important. What's going to happen today is in just a moment, I'm going to introduce our guest. I don't think we could have a more perfect guest from our perspective to start this year off. After our guest comments, and hopefully there'll be time for some Q&A, we will go over some of the things that happened since last month's call and a couple of highlights from the year. And we'll go over what we're asking you to do this month and kind of laying out what is going to happen for the rest of this year. So Dr. Noah Kaufman is a research scholar at the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia, leading research focused on climate change policy. He also teaches a course on energy decarbonization. During the Obama administration, he served as the Deputy Associate Director of Energy and Climate Change at the White House Council on Environmental Quality. And most importantly, from our perspective, in 2019, Dr. Kaufman published a paper about the impacts, both in terms of working to get towards net zero by 2050, and also the economic impacts of the Energy Innovation and Carbon-Dividend Act. So I can't imagine how we could have a better guest to kick things off. And Dr. Kaufman, it's so great to see you, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Just making sure you can hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. I'm glad I didn't ask how many people join these calls beforehand because I haven't had time to get nervous. But it is definitely an honor to be asked. I've long admired your organization, just from all the volunteers, or the infectious positivity you all have, and then just day to day working with folks like Danny and Jerry and Ben has always been a pleasure. So it's great to be here. What I was going to do is mainly talk about one recent project that we came out with last year on what we call net zero consistent carbon prices. And then at the end, hopefully I'll have time to just briefly touch on a couple other relevant pieces of work related to sort of how carbon price fits into a broader policy strategy. With that, I guess let's get started. I'm looking forward to the Q&A most of all. So hopefully I'll get through this relatively quickly. The premise of this particular study I'm going to talk to is that, I work at a policy center at Columbia. So we spent a lot of time talking to policymakers and staff. And the question they tend to ask us, maybe more than any other, is, yeah, if we're designing a carbon price, what's the right price to set? And, you know, they're not interested in our take on the politics. They're saying, sort of starting from first principles, what's the right price? And if you ask an economist that question traditionally, they'll typically answer in one of two ways. They'll either say, well, there's no such thing as a right price on carbon, or they'll point to a concept called the social cost of carbon. And the social cost of carbon is essentially this sort of textbook idea that we're going to count up all of the damages caused by a ton of carbon dioxide emissions and balance it with the costs of reducing emissions and set the price that way. It's a great theory. In practice, it's just not very helpful to policymakers. You see on my screen here, you have this long, decades-long literature on the social cost of carbon that finds that the right carbon prices can be anywhere from about $0 to over $1,000 a ton, which is essentially no carbon price to the strongest carbon price you could possibly imagine. So we started there and said, well, you know, I guess I was going to make one other point here, which is maybe most notoriously, Bill Nordhaus, who's a Yale professor and sort of the pioneer of this social cost of carbon metric, very famously, when he won the Nobel Prize a few years ago, showed that his social cost of carbons, when implemented as carbon prices, led to what he called an optimal pathway to 4 degrees Celsius in the 2100s. Which caused a lot of people, I think, in the climate world to say, wait a second, 4 degrees Celsius is not what we are looking for. So in any case, moving on from that, we said, social cost of carbon isn't that helpful. We don't want to just shrug our shoulders. We want to be useful. So what's the best we can do? And that's where we came up with what we call our near-term to net zero CO2 prices. And this is just a snapshot of the publication in Nature Climate Change last year. I hope everybody will check it out. And we start by saying, what are the attributes that we want in a carbon price when we're thinking about that price level? And we describe a list of 4. So first of all, like the social cost of carbon, we are interested in balancing the costs of emissions reductions with the benefits in terms of reduced climate damages. Second, a concept that we call your credible precision. That is exactly what the social cost of carbon doesn't have. It's the ability to point to a number and say, I have a method that lends support for that number instead of others. And then 3 and 4 are pretty self-explanatory. We want the method to be as transparent and understandable as possible, and we want it to be consistent with the objectives of the policymakers who are going to use it. So there's a lot of things that aren't on here. Again, politics is huge and important, but just not modelable by people like me, so it's outside the scope of our study. What we came up with, again, we call it near-term to net zero. It's 4 simple steps. It's really nothing revolutionary. We think this is how policymakers think about this issue already. We're just providing some rigor or formality in the case of a carbon price. You can see the steps here. Number 1, you want to set a target, a net zero CO2 emissions target. Net zero is really important. It's not just a slogan. At the global level, net zero is where warming stops. So, unlike a concept like 2 degrees or some temperature constraint, net zero relates directly to the science, and it's easy to divvy up a net zero target, right? Because everyone's got to get there at least eventually on average. So the second step is setting an emissions pathway to that target. The third step is to estimate the prices that, when you combine them with other policies, is consistent with that desired emissions pathway in the near term. So I want to say 2 things about this third step that are the key differentiators between what we've done and what a lot of the other work out there on carbon pricing has tended to do. First of all, focusing on the near term. So when we say near term, on these climate timescales, we're talking about a decade is how far we're looking. And a lot of the other work has been done just because climate is such a long-term problem. People look out to 2050 or 2100 and they say, what are the carbon prices we need to get all the way there? And in our judgment, the types of models that we use here just aren't useful on that type of time scale. We can't predict technological innovation or the evolution of economies over a century. We can, I think a decade is really starting to strain credibility on that front. So that's number one. The second differentiator is the combining it with other policies, which I think should be the most intuitive thing in the world. Just maybe the easiest example to use is to think about internal combustion vehicles, right? And if we do want to get to zero, we need everyone to switch away from those vehicles. But the idea that we're going to do that just by raising the price of gasoline enough, it's not what we should do. It's not how policy making will actually happen. We want to combine a carbon price, which would raise the gasoline price, with a lot of other measures that would promote new technologies, invest in charging stations and other infrastructure, maybe fuel economy standards and those kinds of measures. And when you do those other things, it affects the carbon price that you need to achieve a given emissions outcome. So these are the 4 steps. The last step is just to iterate, because we say the other reason that we don't have to go all the way out to 2050 or 2100 is because uncertainty is going to resolve itself to some extent over time. And we want our method to update when that happens. So those are the 4 steps. The second half of our paper is to put some numbers behind it. We use one specific model called GCAM, which is imperfect like all models. So that's why we're calling these findings illustrative, but we do look at emissions pathways for the United States as a whole and say, what are the prices that are consistent with those pathways? So if you look on the left side of the screen here, the 3 different colors represent targets in 2040, 2050, and 2060. We're not advocating for any of them. We're just trying to be relevant. And 2050, I think in particular, is the one that gets the most support these days. So if you look at that light blue bar there, that's a straight line pathway to net zero emissions in 2050. And then if you move over to the other side of the screen, you see the blue range of CO2 prices, which come out to in the ballpark of $50 a ton in 2025 and $100 a ton in 2030. And then the last thing is sorry if this slide is a bit messy, but the last thing you see is this black bar here, this black range, and that's the range of proposals in Congress over the last couple of years and their carbon prices. And the interesting thing to us was that the 2050 results at least fall roughly within those ranges of existing proposals. We did a bunch of uncertainty analysis, and I won't go through all of these just because obviously these results depend on things like oil prices and technological progress and how the economy evolves. So we looked at all of those things and found that that's how we got our range of results that you saw on the other screen. In particular, again, complementary policies is one of the biggest drivers. And you can see that here with sort of the high complementary and the low complementary scenarios. The more you use other investments, regulations, those kinds of things, the less there is for the carbon price to do, so the lower carbon price that you need, and vice versa. So the takeaway for us of this study, and we hope readers as well, is that these near-term to net zero prices, that they're certainly not perfect, but we think that they can help policymakers set prices in a way that social cost of carbon cannot. We think it's sort of interesting that our at least illustrative results are similar to existing proposals, and maybe you guys will be interested in the similarities to the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act in particular. And then you see a few different caveats on the screen here that are important. Maybe the one I'll point to in particular is if you have different jurisdictions using this same method, they're going to come out with different results. So maybe some of you saw that Canada just put out its own big climate plan just a couple of weeks ago that involved some very high carbon prices, going to, I think, 170 Canadian dollars a ton by 2030. But the context is important because Canada, you would expect, would actually need much higher carbon prices than the United States to achieve the same progress. And that's because their electricity system is very clean to begin with. They don't have this huge amount of dirty coal still existing in the mix that is sort of relatively low-hanging fruit to reduce emissions that we have here. So that's that study. Mark, do I have a couple more minutes still to talk about these other studies? How am I doing on time?
You're doing great.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'll be brief, but so this issue of sort of a broader policy strategy is something that my group at Columbia has focused a lot of attention on the last few years. And I think the politics of today, as Mark alluded to earlier, sort of bears this out, given the diversity of views and ideologies looking at this problem. So one thing we did in a study released in 2019 was to just try to provide an analytical framework or a conceptual framework to policymakers to say what types of policies fit well alongside a carbon price in a broader policy strategy. So the first thing we did was provide some definitions. So you see that on the bottom of the screen here. We say a policy is complementary to a carbon price if it can enable lower cost emissions reductions or achieve a separate policy objective at a lower cost compared to just a price alone. And then we defined a redundant policy as one that raises cost without achieving additional emissions reductions. And what we went about to do is to take those definitions and assign policy types across the spectrum, which you can see on the screen here, from more redundant on the right to more complementary on the left. And at least if policies are designed well, which is our assumption, and of course there's a massive caveat, well-designed policies, there's quite a few of them that can be very complementary with the price on carbon. I won't go down the list, but it's on the left side of the screen here. All the way to the right side of the screen, just one category did we label as fully redundant. And that's the idea of regulating the emissions from a facility that are also subject to the same emissions are subject to the carbon price. There may be reasons why policymakers want that redundancy, but we declared those types of regulations redundant. So that's one study. The last one I wanted to mention was to take that conceptual framework, and then in a more recent study, we asked the question of, well, what actually moves the needle? So if you start actually as our sort of baseline or business as usual scenarios, we start with two different carbon taxes, what we call a low tax in light blue here and a high tax in dark blue. And it sort of spanned the range of the existing proposals in Congress was how we came up with these taxes. And then what we did was layer sector-specific policies on top of those taxes to get a sense of what's the most important from an emissions perspective. So the results that you see on the screen here look at million metric tons of CO2 by 2030, and ranges that capture at least some of the uncertainty involved. And you can see, I guess I'll point out a couple of things. First of all, the size of whether you have a high tax or a low tax matters in some cases and less in others. The top category here, limiting natural gas plant build outs in the 2020s, actually provides a lot of emissions reductions if your carbon tax is low, and does very little if your carbon tax is high, because the tax itself accomplishes that goal, at least in our analysis. And then the other thing to look at, which I think is kind of interesting and maybe counterintuitive, is that you have electrification of vehicles in the transport sector, electrification of appliances in the building sector. These are actions that we tend to think are pretty critical for long-term decarbonization. If we want to get to net zero in 2050, we desperately need to get moving. But because the stock turnover in these areas is so slow, you only get a few percent of consumers replacing their cars or their furnaces every year. You don't get a huge bang for your buck in the 2020s, which it presents sort of an interesting trade-off in priorities for policymakers. You know, if they want to get on that steep emissions reduction path now, or if they want to focus on sort of best setting themselves up for the long run. So I think with that, I will stop and thank you all again. I have my contact information here, so please reach out and
fantastic.
Take any
so
questions.
Flannery's been monitoring the questions in the chat. I have a couple of things I want to follow up with, but I do want to ask Flannery kind of what the themes are in the chat that people want answered first, and then I'll see if there's time for my own questions. So Flannery, what are you hearing from people?
We have a few questions wondering what are the impacts of a regulatory approach versus a straightforward carbon price, and particularly how would that affect low-income households going the regulatory route versus a carbon pricing route?
Yeah, well, I mean, first, I guess I'll say those are not necessarily mutually exclusive concepts, because if you think back to, you know, there was the Clean Power Plan of the Obama administration, which essentially allowed states to set up carbon prices in the power sector if they wanted to, right? So you can have regulations that enable market-based solutions. But I think this, if I can get at maybe the spirit of the question, which is sort of market-based versus command and control, sort of mandates for what you need to do. I mean, for low-income households, there's two competing things going on. Number one is the revenue from the carbon price, which is really important, as I'm sure you all know from advocating for this policy. If you use even a portion of the revenue, but certainly all of the revenue, to compensate those who pay the price, you can retain the incentives for emissions reductions while making sure that the price increases don't harm low-income households, that they come out ahead based on the money that they get back. So that's the good side. The bad side with something like a carbon price is that you're forcing consumers to pay for all of the emissions, whereas you can design regulations to basically say, we're not going to worry about emissions up to a certain point. We're only going to worry about them above a certain emissions rate or something like that. So if you think about something like a clean electricity standard, the price impacts of that in the power sector are probably going to be lower than the price impacts of a carbon price. You just don't have the revenue to compensate.
Okay, and then we also have a question. Eric is wondering if you've presented this study to members of Congress, and if so, how did they react, or what did they ask you?
We have. I mean, probably a few members of Congress and as many staffers who will respond to our emails, and the reaction has been positive. Sort of like I said before, for most people who focus on climate, we've found sort of relief that people in our position are just sort of thinking about the issue the way they do. They're already thinking about how do we get on net zero consistent targets. A lot of them are interested in carbon pricing. So merging those concepts has been, we hope, useful for a lot of them.
Flannery, let me follow up on that for just a second, if you don't mind. So last year you testified before Energy and Commerce. There was some comments you made about a carbon price and GDP over, I believe, about a decade. And could you tell us what the nature of your comments were there?
Yes, you're testing my memory, but the literature, there's a long literature now on economic impacts of carbon pricing, and the basic conclusion is that there just isn't that much evidence that the carbon price is a big impact on economic output one way or the other. And if you use the revenue in really pro-growth ways, you could absolutely see a carbon price that added to GDP. If you took the money and burned it, you would think that it would be problematic. But when we've actually gone back and sort of taken an empirical look at things, how have places that put it into carbon price fared? It's pretty close to neutral, which is great, because that's essentially our metric of the cost of the policy, right? So the benefits of the emissions reductions, if we're thinking of economic impacts as the costs, and the costs are near zero, that's a pretty good deal.
Yeah. Flannery, we have time for one more. Do you have one more that jumped out at your attention?
Sure. A lot of people were wanting to dig into the graphs and the slides. Are those going to be, are those available somewhere? Could they look at the study, or could you make those available to folks?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. What I can do is, I don't know if everyone, if I can insert a link into the chat or something like that, I can give you a link to it. If you Google near term to net zero nature climate change, it should.
Perfect. Okay, we'll get a link for that in the chat for everyone who is asking for the slides.
Great. And I think one thing that the slides validate is that there's, there's points that we need to hit in 2025, 2030 in terms of where the price needs to be to get to net zero by 2050. And I think one of the things those slides show is that the Energy Innovation Act is within the range of those prices.
That's right. And I guess the one thing, if you're steeped in the economic literature on this, economists historically have tended to recommend prices that rise at a slower rate. A lot of proposals have prices rise at the interest rate, which can be very low. Our method doesn't show that. Our method shows a much higher rate of increase, which is very much consistent. I don't know, I think maybe you guys were just way ahead of us and figured this out, or maybe it's a happy coincidence. But yeah, it's much more in line with your policy proposal, that price increase.
Yep. Flannery, you've got 2 more minutes. Do you have one more that you wanted to ask?
Let's see. We have a question from Sarah asking if, do you think carbon pricing drives innovation? That's a common talking point that we hear from members of Congress that want to support innovation. How would you answer that?
It's a hard thing to measure, but certainly from a conceptual standpoint, we think it does. Because if you have a signal to the economy that says in 10 years, we're going to have, emissions fall by 40, 50% or whatever, and in 30 years, we need a carbon-free economy, that's a really strong signal to people putting in place investment dollars now that the money is going to be in the lower carbon solutions, right? And that's the process by which we think innovation happens. I guess that's one side of the process. The other side of the process is you put in place a climate policy, you get deployments now. And when you get the big deployments now, you have something we call learning by doing, where the more we do something, the better we get at it. That's certainly what we've seen with solar over the years, where the price has just fallen, the more we've gotten better at it. So I think both of those effects combined make us believe it certainly should accelerate innovation. Again, it's a really, really hard thing to measure in practice.
Great. Well, we have certainly wanted you on this call for a long time, and this didn't disappoint at all. This has been fantastic. Zoom stops counting for our webinars at 1,200 people. Wow. So we know there's at least 1,200 people on live, and there'll be another at least 5,000 or 10,000 who will listen to the recording. So we're glad that we could get you in front of a bunch of people, and you're welcome to stay on the next 10 minutes with us while we go over a couple of things, but we've been looking forward to this, and we're really, really pleased you could join us.
That's great. Well, thanks again for having me.
Great, fantastic. Okay, so a few things I want to go over that's happened since last month's call or just from last year. Many of you are aware that in the COVID relief package, there were 3 bills that we had worked on as secondary asks as part of our June and December lobby day. And in fact, between June and December, we added 68 co-sponsors, which created a lot of momentum of those bills actually being included in the COVID relief package. In December, despite the fact that it was all virtual meetings, we were able to have 405 meetings 24% of which were with actually the member of the House or Senate. That's a very high percentage of getting face-to-face meetings, so great work on that. So that ends up with us having at least 1,278 meetings last year. We had a goal between Giving Tuesday and the end of the year to raise $1 million, and you actually raised $1,117,092. So congratulations, thank you all so much who worked for you to be able to donate. It's so important that we're able to fund our work, particularly where we're at a moment that we have worked towards where we know we need bipartisan support, and that's been the position we put ourselves in for a long time. And so it gives us a very, very good chance to seize the moment. There were an enormous number of endorsements last year. And now, just on municipal endorsements, we have 108 municipal endorsements of the Energy Innovation and Carbon-Dividend Act that represents over 22 million people from the cities the municipalities have endorsed. A lot of you last year worked on the Environmental Voter Project, getting people to vote that the environment's a big commitment for them, but they just don't vote. They haven't developed a new habit. And there were 115,381 people who were turned out to vote in the Georgia election last week that are usually not predictable voters. And I know some of you worked on that, so thank you for that also. Very good work. This year, newspapers are somewhat challenging for us. I mean, we get a lot of coverage with letters to the editor and op-eds and editorials from newspapers, but the letters to the editor it's a tough row now. In my case, the San Diego Union Tribune only publishes letters to the editor 3 days a week. Where I grew up in Salt Lake City, I've been told that the Salt Lake Tribune is going from a daily to a weekly publication. So, we had over 2,000 letters to the editor, but that's not a huge number for us. But here's what is a huge number. Y'all got 648 op-eds published. That's crazy. What I think it says is that just like you've been fostering relationships with congressional offices, you've been doing the same thing with your newspaper, where you're a trusted messenger for them. They know that you're going to send something that's professional, that's backed up, that cites its references, and that it's something that the newspaper is going to want in their newspaper. So the fact that you all got 648 op-eds published is really, really something. Okay, so what are we doing this month? Well, there's a kind of a new way we're going to recommend you going about your work. Last month, we asked you to plan out what your plan is for this year. And we want you to, if you haven't already begin that work, but then also the work that you're doing, whether you're writing members of Congress or letters to the editor, we'd like you to try something new, which is whether it's just 2 of you or 3 of you or 4 of you, to get together on Zoom and do that work together and compare your notes. We've been working to build a community, and obviously it's a challenging work in a virtual world, but we think that it can help enhance and expand that sense of community if you do it together sometimes. So we'd like you to just try it out. And if it works for you, expand it. And I think particularly if you can include some of the new people in your chapter, just doing the work together continues to build relationship and community. We've said from day one here that we're betting everything on relationships. So that is members of Congress, it's papers, but it's also each other. Also, I know we just saw most of the Congress in December, but we're not waiting. We're going to have a lobby week, March 22nd through 29th. We'd like you to start planning that work. The most important part is just finding out who's going to schedule the appointment. We can't have a meeting if somebody doesn't ask for it. So that's all, there's all backup for that in the action sheet of getting the process started. And we want to hit this year really hard and fast. Social media, we want you to please use social media to reach out for people. And then please, I hope you practice the laser talk about climate policy and urgency. Okay, last thing I want to do today is just kind of sketch out what's happening from now till the end of the year. In January and February, we will be hosting some virtual regional conferences. So we're looking forward to seeing those of you who it works for you to attend. In June, we are going to have our June conference on the dates. We would have had it even if we'd stayed at the Omni in DC. We're not. But the second weekend in June, followed by a lobby week. So we're planning on, seeing the Congress in December, seeing the Congress in March, seeing the Congress again in June. So we will keep that press up for the whole year. And then the last thing is, we do 2 conferences a year. We are planning to do the November conference live in DC. That's all going to depend on the vaccines working and enough of us being able to travel. Now, I know for a lot of us, we found that we can be very effective in a virtual world, and that's a good thing. And I know that for some of us, we're saying because it also reduces the carbon footprint so much that maybe we should only do our conferences virtually. Here's why I think it's important that for those of you who it works, that we go back in November. Because we have such a reverent appreciation of DC, of the members of Congress and their staff that we meet with. I know many of you have described the same experience that I have, walking those halls. Just every single year to me, it's incredibly awe-striking. I'm humbled by it. I feel honored to be able to be a chance to be a part of my government. And I think that this Congress, our country, could use a dose of CCL as soon as it works for us all to be there together. So we will continue to work virtually. I hope you're all being incredibly careful, but I do hope that it works for us to be there in DC in November. I think it will send a strong message to our Congress, our government, not just about action on climate change, but about basic decency and the way you treat people. All right, thanks everybody. I know we were so happy. I'd just like to give a big shout out again for Dr. Kaufman for joining us. Thank you all. We'll see you next month. Bye everybody.